Kipp, thanks for coming on the show, dude. I'm excited to talk to you today.
It's my pleasure. Me too.
We were just talking off camera about the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
What were you explaining? That basically they're based off of something that was forged?
So as I understand it, and I'm the medieval manuscripts and stuff, that's not my expertise, but as I understand it, so the Da Vinci Code is a novel by Dan Brown based on a popular book that was published called Holy Blood and Holy Grail. And that particular book is based on a collection of manuscripts called the Protocols of Zion, which is a medieval forgery, basically. And it's like an anti-Semitic forgery.
An anti-Semitic forgery.
I don't know a lot about this, but what I do know is that it's bullcrap. Like it's bullshit. There's there is nothing that we can see from legitimate history, from the actual documents that we know as authentic, which reflect a reality about the church in the medieval period that aligns with what's in these other forged manuscripts. So
does he know about this now? The author of that book, Dan Brown, or whoever his name is?
Well, I don't think Dan Brown cares because he's writing a novel, right? But the other guys, I assume so, and they might not care either, because for some of these guys, it's just about selling books. Right. So who knows? And all sorts of stuff, all sorts of crap gets published and gets discredited, and authors will oftentimes just not care.
Right.
So who knows?
So for people listening, what is your background and what is your expertise?
Right. So I am I'm a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. I did my terminal work, my PhD work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are early Jewish manuscripts. There's a lot of the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls are our earliest biblical manuscripts. So these are our earliest copies of things that became part of the Bible. So I do all of my work in early Jewish manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I call myself also a Hebrew Bible scholar, because I'm basically I do a lot of my work in the text of the Bible. So I hope that was clear.
So when can you give people basically a history of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah.
They were discovered in like the early 1900s. Is that right?
So the scrolls were discovered in 1946.
Oh, 1946.
The first ones were discovered in 1946. So sometime in February, and this is a famous story, sometime in February 1946, a couple of shepherd boys were looking along the western shore of the Dead Sea in the caves there. Anyone who's been to Israel or to the Dead Sea will know that along the cliffs, they're literally honeycombed with thousands and thousands of caves. And so these boys are looking for a lost sheep among these caves. One of them throws a rock into one of the caves and hears the breaking of pottery. They muster the courage to go in, and they find these linen wraps that have scrolls in them. Scrolls are made of leather. They take them back with them to camp. Some of the stories at this point, here we have a number of pictures of some of the manuscripts in situ. But some of the stories at this point get kind of interesting, because what you're dealing with is the recollections of these Bedouin sheep herders and when they discovered things and what happened to them. Some of the things that we have heard is that when the first of these manuscripts were discovered, they set them on a tent peg, and they just sat there in the wind and the rain for several months before anyone ever decided to do anything with them. Over the course of a number of months, eventually they took these things that they found into the markets in Bethlehem and tried to find someone who would be interested in buying them not very successfully. People weren't interested in them until they encountered a Syrian Orthodox Palestinian by the name of Khalil Iskander Shahin. His nickname is Kando. I don't know why he's called that, but that's how he's widely known. He was a cobbler, fixed shoes, but he also was starting to deal in antiquities, and he recognized that on these leather rolls they have writing on them. So he thought, well, maybe this is something interesting. Maybe this is something valuable. So he took two of them, and contacted his metropolitan, so the leader of his church, thinking they were Syriac manuscripts. Syriac is a form of Aramaic. This is the language of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the old Orthodox Church. So thinking it was Syriac, he took them to the metropolitan, like the priest, to look at them, and he recognized right away, no, it's not Syriac, it's Hebrew, and it looks like it's really old. So, over the course of about a year, they determined that these are probably really old. They got in contact with experts at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem to take a look at the manuscripts that they had. And the one gentleman that they got in contact with, his name is Eliezer Sukenik. He was a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University, and he came out to the church where these things were being held, and he looked at the manuscripts, and he got really excited because these, based on his just visual examination, these looked like potentially the oldest Hebrew manuscripts ever discovered. And importantly, the one manuscript was a large copy of the book of Isaiah, which is a book in the Bible. And this would be one of the earliest biblical manuscripts discovered.
Prior to discovering these, what was the earliest Hebrew manuscript ever discovered?
The Leningrad Codex, which dates to about the 10th century AD. So the Dead Sea Scrolls date between the
1,000 years.
second. It's like you're pushing the clock back 1,000 years, which is why scholars got really, really excited about this discovery. So it sounds like sort of a providential moment too. This is certainly the way that Sukenik paints it, because at the time, the scrolls were discovered in 1946. He didn't actually see them until November 1947. Sorry, no, it was November 1946. Yeah, that's right. But at the time, the British mandate in Palestine was just coming to an end. This is, at the end of the Second World War. Tensions in Jerusalem and in the region were very high. Mm-hmm. And in order for him he had to get from Jerusalem to go see the stuff in Bethlehem. And in order for him to get from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, he had to get passes to travel through military checkpoints. Wow. And ended up seeing the manuscripts. There were 3 of them that he saw. Mm-hmm. One was a copy of the book of Isaiah. Excuse me. We'll cut that stuff out, right? Sorry.
No, you're good, man.
So one was a copy of the book of Isaiah. There was another manuscript that is now called the Chodayot, which is a Hebrew word that just means thanksgiving songs. And it's like a collection of prayers and songs. And then the third manuscript that he had is called the War Scroll, which is it's like this wild telling of the last days when the angels of God are going to meet with the demons and the forces of evil in this final climactic battle. So these last two are texts that are not in the Bible. These are texts nobody had seen before this time. So they found, he saw these three manuscripts, got really excited about them, convinced his university, the Hebrew university, that they needed to buy them. So he got the funding to go back and purchase them, made the journey once again, this harrowing journey through military checkpoints, taking his life into his own hands to go and purchase these three manuscripts, and got them back home securely on the evening of the 29th of November, which was the same day that the United Nations had voted on the proposal of the independent state of Israel. So he's reading the text of the oldest copy of Isaiah known to man at this point, and he's listening on the radio to the United Nations make the announcement of the founding of the state of Israel. And in his own private diary, Sukenik wrote about this. He said, this moment of tremendous significance I celebrated in my own home. One was political and the other was cultural. Wow. So it felt like destiny, right? And since that moment, the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, their discovery and their significance has been wrapped up in the history of the state of Israel. So, in the original discoveries, the scrolls were featured in museum displays and discussed by the earliest prime ministers and presidents as almost guarantors of their legitimacy as a nation.
Right.
So, and this, it's something that I mean, there's a lot more to say here in terms of just the ways in which the scrolls were collected by scholars and how they were published, and then how scholars and politicians really kind of use this material as a means to forward their own ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we get into that, there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's like over a dozen caves, right? And there's there's like hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that were found right there in that area.
Not quite. So there is 12 caves. 12 caves. There's 11 caves that were part of the original discoveries between 1947 and 1953, and they are numbered in terms of when they were discovered, cave 1 through cave 11. Right. Only 10 of those caves they found manuscripts in. The other 2, they had some pieces of fragments of pottery and linen. The 12th cave is one that was discovered fairly recently. Scholars think there was possibly manuscripts in this cave, but were unable to find any. We think there's possibly manuscripts just based on the fact that some of the linen that was found there matches the linen in which a number of the manuscripts in the other caves were wrapped in, as well as some of the pottery. A number of the manuscripts were actually stored in jars, which really helped with their preservation.
Yeah, 2,000 years.
Yeah. So
wait, how long would it have been in the 1900s? Yeah, it was like 2,000 years. Right?
At least 2,000 years. If you think these manuscripts date from as early as maybe even the late 3rd century BC. Wow. So up to, 200 BC, or when some of the oldest ones are, all the way up to about 70. And then there have been other, that's just the Qumran caves. There've been a couple of other important discoveries in the Judean desert at a place called Nachal Hever.
I'm sure you've heard me talk about Mando's whole body deodorant at this point. I saw Dr. Shannon Klingman in an ad for Mando, and I just couldn't believe it, so I had to reach out. It's this bar right here. Yes, it's deodorant, and you can use it on your entire body.
It's dermatologist tested and gentle on your man bits. It controls odor for 72 hours. It's clinically proven. You can choose from 4 cologne quality scents or unscented if you want to go stealthy.
Mando is powered by mandelic acid, and my favorite is their cleansing bar in bourbon leather. And it visibly evens out skin tone and reduces acne scars. Same for their body wash, but it's the deodorant that I use. I cannot recommend it enough.
The starter pack is the best way into Mando, and new customers get $5 off Mando's best-selling starter pack with code DANNY at shopmando.com. So, what makes Mando so unique?
Mando is the only deodorant that is safe to use on all of your body parts. Your pits, your package, your grundle, your balls, your belly folds, and your feet.
It was created by a doctor who saw firsthand how normal BO was being misdiagnosed and mistreated.
Mando's whole body deodorant is powerful enough for the toughest body odor, but gentle enough to use anywhere, allowing you to put Mando on your family jewels without any worry, because Mando is aluminum-free, baking soda-free, cruelty-free, dye-free, and vegan.
So Danny, is it clinically proven to control odor better than a shower with soap alone?
12 hours after a shower, the average man's grundle odor was a 5 out of 10. With Mando, average grundle odor level was 0 out of 10. Mando's starter pack is perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, and 2 free products of your choice, like mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. And luckily, I have a discount code to help you get hooked on my favorite whole body deodorant. New customers get $5 off the starter pack with my exclusive code. That equates to over 40% off your starter pack. Use code DANNY at shopmando.com. That's code DANNY at shopmando.com. Use code DANNY at shopmando.com. That's code DANNY at shopmando.com. It's linked below. Now back to the show.
They discovered manuscripts at a place called Murabat. They discovered manuscripts at Masada, which is the famous place where the Jewish rebels at the end of the first revolt in the year 70 AD, where they had their final stand against the Romans. They found manuscripts.
It's called Masada?
Masada.
Is that where they got the name Mossad from their spy agency?
I don't think so, but but that's a good thought. I've never really thought about that. It's a site. Masada is right on the southern end of the Dead Sea. It's a huge. It's on a big outcropping of the cliffs. Mm-hmm. It's where Herod the Great built his winter palace. It's kind of he went to go spend his winters.
Oh, wow.
At this fabulous site. It's pretty cool.
How many total manuscripts are there?
So. In the 11 caves, there is now, it gets a bit difficult in terms of actually counting the individual manuscripts, because what we have are fragments, and fragments of a wide range of varying sizes. So, but estimates are that there are somewhere between 800 and 900 complete manuscripts. And these are reconstructed from tens of thousands of individual fragments.
Ah, right. Okay.
And they're not evenly distributed in the 11 caves, too. Mm-hmm. There were 70 manuscripts that came out of Cave 1. There were just a handful of manuscripts that came out of Cave 2 and Cave 3. But we can talk about Cave 3 in a bit, because it's really important. Cave 3 is where they discovered the Copper Scroll, which is... just as it sounds. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Perhaps the most important cave that was discovered was Cave 4. It had over 500 manuscripts in it. And it looks like it might have been something like a library.
500 fragments or
manuscripts?
Manuscripts, wow.
Manuscripts. So and Cave 4 is very close to the actual, it's literally a stone's throw away from the actual site where the people who lived where the people who collected and wrote this material probably lived. So the current theory is that this was actually like a library for them. Cave 4, there's evidence that they had shelves built into the walls. It's a man-made cave. So it's something that they actually dug out of.
It was excavated.
Yeah, it was excavated.
Wow.
So they stored. It seems like they stored their precious manuscripts in this cave. So yeah, but and that's where I tend to think, like, when I'm working on the scrolls myself, understanding the relationship between the individual manuscripts and their find site, the actual caves, is pretty important. Because Cave 4, I tend to think of as an active place where they were storing manuscripts that they used on a regular basis. I tend to look there first when I'm working on the material. Cave 1 looks like it might have been a depository for manuscripts that had worn out and were no longer being used. So, you have to think about the function of these things as you're appraising, what they're about, why they're significant, why they're important. So out of those 800 or 900 manuscripts that were discovered, the thing that got scholars really, really excited at the outset was that 200 to 300 of these were copies of texts from the Bible. So, and again, we're pushing the clock back here.
Copies
1,000 years
of texts from the Bible.
Yes.
From what Bible?
I guess it would be the Hebrew Bible, if you're Jewish, the Christian Old Testament.
When was the Hebrew Bible written?
So that's a complicated question.
I thought it was written later, way later.
No. So I mean, I guess there requires some clarification here. It's a bit of an anachronistic term to talk about the Hebrew Bible at this period, because the Hebrew Bible is a collection of these ancient texts. So at the time that it got put together, at the time that somebody said, let's put these things together and turn them into a book, that's later.
1000
but the
AD?
individual, probably before that.
Before 1000 AD.
Yeah, and actually we have some evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls that they were already starting to put a number of these texts together. I like to think of one of the things that were discovered in Cave 4 is something called the reworked Pentateuch, which is a version of the Torah. With one of the other exciting things discovered was that there's different versions of the same books. So it looks like they had some sense of variety for saying, the same things. Some of the manuscripts preserve this text called the reworked Pentateuch, which looks like maybe the earliest attempt to put together Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all in the same scroll. And this dates to about the mid-2nd century.
So how are the Dead Sea Scrolls copies of something if the Dead Sea Scrolls were the earliest Hebrew texts we have?
Well, they were copied from something, right? And because we have multiple copies of many of the same texts, like, for example, I mentioned some of the first manuscripts that were discovered were copies of Isaiah, a book from the Bible. We have multiple copies. So we actually have 22 copies of Isaiah, different manuscripts that they had of the same book. So they're clearly copying it from earlier sources.
Earlier sources that we don't have.
We don't have those.
We think that they exist.
Yes.
We just don't have any evidence.
And scholars usually date manuscripts or date texts on a variety of features of those texts. Language changes over time. So based on some of the smattering of epigraphic evidence that we have of writing, Hebrew writing from, the Iron Age, which is, from like 900 BC up to 600 BC, which is when most scholars tend to think a lot of these texts were written. You look at the language that's used there as a way to say, well, the language forms seems to come from this earlier period. And then just the social economic situation that's presented. Many of the texts from the Hebrew Bible talk about this terrible war that took place between or this terrible invasion by the Assyrians into Samaria, which happened in 722 BCE. The way a lot of the texts talk about this event sounds like a current event. So it seems likely that was probably when some of these things were written. Of course, this gets...
We're talking like 6,000 years ago?
No, not quite that many. So what is that? 722 BC. So that's, yeah, so it's like on less than 3,000 years ago.
Okay.
So, but this also gets really complicated though, too.
It's so complicated. This is one of the most complicated topics I've ever really gotten into.
It really is. And one of the reasons for that is because so much of our material for this comes later. And we recognize from the material too, that people are already editing and rewriting stuff that's older. They're adding to it.
Right.
They're supplementing it. We have signs within the Dead Sea Scrolls of text that are actively being reworked and rewritten
Today.
No, at the time that they were being composed. So it's a complicated picture. So,
and you discovered fake Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yes. Now
I assume that without knowing anything about it, that there was an antiquities market and people were just trying to profit off of this.
Yes.
Or was it likely somebody had some sort of narrative to push with some?
I think probably more the former.
Okay.
Although some of the agendas do play a role here, and we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So I'll just talk a little bit about my story.
Okay.
In 2011, I got a position, a fellowship to work on Dead Sea Scrolls fragments in a private collection in Norway. These manuscripts belonged to a a collector by the name of Martin Skoyen, who collected all sorts of things. Like he collected artifacts from ancient Babylon. He has a fine collection of Buddhist manuscripts. He's got folios that he bought that come out of the Vatican. He's even got some modern stuff. Like he had an early draft copy of The Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Like he's just he is a consummate collector. He collects everything. One of the things that he collects are these Dead Sea Scrolls fragments. He has over 30 of them. I was hired to help with the publication of his small collection of fragments. In the time that I was working there, I and other members of my team started seeing suspicious things on these small fragments themselves that looked quite different from what we know of the actual authentic collection of Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. So in the course of a couple of years, we developed a system of criteria for testing whether manuscripts on a cursory examination were likely authentic or forged. Some of the things that I think are fairly easy to spot. If you can imagine, a small fragment of material, it comes from a larger manuscript, and the idea is that it's broken away and the rest of it's worn off. It's got lines of text on it. On some of the fragments, you would notice that the lines would follow the edges of the fragment and not just go straight across, which is weird. A lot of the letters looked misshapen, as if, they were the fragment was already damaged at the time that it was being written. And it's
could you carbon date them to see what
they're too small, because you require quite a bit of material. Especially with private collectors who have these tiny little things, convincing them to carbon date some of their already tiny little fragments, because it requires a certain amount of material to destroy. Right. You have to destroy the material to carbon date it. So, they're extremely reluctant to do that. Most of the dating actually occurs through something called paleography, where we look at handwriting styles. Before typeset printing, everything was written by hand, and handwriting styles developed and evolved over time. So it's in particular in these earlier periods when everything was handwritten, writing itself was a much more controlled discipline in terms of learning it. There were very specific ways you learned to write. So it becomes more, I guess, consistent, especially when working on formal manuscripts as opposed to like little documents or letters that you're just writing to your friends. So we date most of this stuff through handwriting styles. It's called paleography.
Interesting.
It's accurate to within about 50 to 100 years, depending on who you're talking to. Some have said that we can paleographically date stuff to within 20 years. I'm skeptical about that. And a number of the manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls have been carbon dated.
You know what's easier than jumping through flaming hoops like one of those little poodles at a dog talent show? Not having to jump through a flaming hoop like a poodle at a dog talent show. Steve wrote this commercial, by the way. So when Mint Mobile said I could click a button and get wireless for $15 a month, I said, cool. Again, Steve wrote this. It was that easy. The hardest part was sitting, blinking, and breathing and wondering where the aliens were. Great job, Steve.
To get started, go to mintmobile.com/Danny. There you'll see that right now all 3-month plans are only $15 a month, including the unlimited plan.
All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts.
Find out how easy it is to switch to Mint Mobile and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month.
Don't let Big Wireless tug you around like a poodle at a dog talent show. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/Danny. That's mintmobile.com/DANNY. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/Danny. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Slower speeds above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions may apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Hit the link below. Now back to the show. How many would you say?
The Dead Sea Scrolls have actually been carbon dated 3 times.
How many of them?
In fact, at this point now, over 100.
Over 100.
Yes. So, and what the carbon dating has done for us is it's actually helped to show that the paleography, the paleographic systems that scholars are using to date the texts are actually pretty good. So, when your paleographical dates match the carbon dates, it shows that you're doing something right. So the scrolls were they were first carbon dated back in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Mm-hmm. Excuse me, I think it was 8 or 10 of these. Interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls were some of the first items ever to have been carbon dated. So it was a new science.
Yeah, back in the 40s.
So it was a big deal when you could finally use this new science. And some of the scrolls were a guinea pig. Many of them were recarbon dated in the 1980s, and now there's another project. Sorry, I got a cough here.
No, you're good. It's okay. We just went through a Category 4 Hurricane Helena.
Yeah,
so
right.
You got an excuse.
So there's a new project that's been underway for the last 5 or 6 years where they've been recarbon dating. I believe it's up to 100 manuscripts. So, and we're still waiting for some of the results of that. But yeah. So when it came to the material that this private collector had, he didn't want to let it go to be carbon dated. Like I said, you have to destroy things in order to date.
But
them properly.
he did let you guys analyze the writing
Yeah.
style.
So
And what did he say to you guys when you were like, this seems like it's bullshit?
well, it was tough, right? Because he's paid a lot of money for these fragments.
How much do they go for, do you know?
Well, I mean, he wouldn't tell me, but in the time that I've been doing this, some of the figures that I've seen, range, these are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
For like a tiny little fragment?
For a tiny little
Like how big
fragment.
we talking? Size of a quarter?
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you very much. So, something ranging from the size of a quarter up to maybe a credit card.
Wow.
So I'll tell you a story here. The source of most of the fragments for sale. Excuse me for a sec. I mentioned Kando, the antiquities dealer, that saw and handled the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
He actually managed to. He worked closely with the first scholars and with the Bedouin who were finding most of this material. He was kind of like the go-between, and so we're told that probably 90% or more of the material actually passed through him. His son, William Kando, is the one who every now and then, after the 1990s, would have Dead Sea Scrolls fragments to sell. When some of these started hitting the markets in the 1990s, he introduced or people knew of this rather large fragment. It's probably it's the size of a page, right? It's called the butterfly fragment because it looks butterfly fragment
And
looks
it's
like
this big.
Yeah, and it looks like a butterfly.
Okay.
Sort
I
of
think I've seen
butterfly
that.
wings.
I think I've seen that.
Maybe.
How much is that thing? I think it's like $1 million. Probably.
So he had listed it for sale originally in, I think it was 2006 or 2007 for $2 million. Now, between then and when I was working on the fragments, which would have been after 2011, the last I heard, the price had gone up to over $40 million.
God damn.
But as far as I know, he didn't. If he's sold it in the time since 2016 or 2017,
$6 million. Man, inflation.
Many millions of dollars. Yeah. So
And that one specifically had been carbon dated.
no, in fact, we don't know a lot about that particular fragment, just because we know it's a
won't let
copy of.
anyone-
Well, yeah, that's sort of the nest egg, right? He's kind of sitting on it. Hoping
What if he
to-
did secretly carbon date it and he found out that it was way newer? He doesn't want to ruin the narrative.
I don't know. I won't. I guess it's possible, but what do I know? So what was I? Right, we were talking about
What were we talking about? You were talking about the value of some of the big,
Yeah.
the big butterfly one,
right,
and the guy
and before that,
Candle who owned 90% of them.
Yeah. So Skoyan though, and his 30 fragments. When we started to have suspicions about these being forgeries, and we finally approached him, what he wanted from us was more certainty about whether these were fake or whether they were authentic. So we worked with a physicist in Berlin, and she developed some tests, and
Physicist.
Yes, non-destructive tests. So checking chemical composition of the ink, checking you can test the fragments for the types of chemicals that were used in the preparation process for them, and a variety of different ways. I don't understand all the science of it, so which is why I wasn't doing that kind of work.
Right.
But we sent. He agreed to send a handful of his fragments to Berlin for testing to check and see whether they were likely authentic or forgeries. It's very difficult to prove one way or the other after the fact, right? We can have very strong, well-founded reasons for thinking that something is a forgery or thinking that something is authentic. But unless you've actually dug it out of the ground in a controlled archaeological excavation, who knows, right? So, and that's the problem with a lot of these things.
And you have a lot of people who want them to be real too.
Yeah, you do. I mean, how badly does the owner of these fragments want them?
Not only that, but the religious types who want them to support their religious ideas.
Them too. So,
it essentially it's a scaffolding for Judaism and the history of Abraham and Noah.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff. In fact,
because without the Dead Sea Scrolls, you could say that Judaism is way newer than we.
That's true,
right?
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up because after Skoyan, a bunch of different, and they tend to be Christian institutions, started buying these tiny little fragments on the antiquities market between the 1990s and 2010. One of them is Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I think it's just outside of Dallas.
Yeah.
So they bought a bunch of fragments and they had an exhibition where they put them on display. People could come and look at them. The press, wrote articles about them. In one of the articles written at the beginning of the exhibition, the director of the exhibit was quoted as saying they have one of the fragments they have is of text from a book in the Bible called Leviticus. And the text on this fragment is from a passage in the book of Leviticus that most Christians interpret to mean that if you're a homosexual, you need to be executed. So they had a fragment which had, this text on it. And in an interview, the director said that the seminary actually paid a lot more money for this particular fragment because he said in the article, he says, this attests to an eternal truth from God's word. So yeah, there's absolutely religious implications to this. But that, and again, I think that particular fragment is probably a forgery. But I haven't looked. I haven't had a close look at it.
And that one has not been carbon dated that we know of?
No. So the results of the tests that were conducted in Berlin were that most likely the fragments that Skoyan had were forgeries. Some of them, just to give you an idea.
Sorry, what did you say? How many?
So he sent 9 fragments to Berlin for testing. Neil really wants me to tell this story.
Good. We got Neil behind the curtain over there. Shout out to Neil.
I was asked to courier the fragments from Oslo to Berlin. So I was nervous about it because, in my mind, these are priceless artifacts. So I went to pick them up from Mr. Skoyan's house, and he had them all packaged for me. And I asked him, I'm like, is there some kind of special documentation or anything that I need when I go through customs? I mean, it looks kind of weird, right? I don't know.
Yeah, for sure.
What is that in your bag there? I don't know. I've never done this before. That's right. So he said it would be fine. And I was like, okay. And then, it was a small enough package. I just had it in my carry-on. Flew into Berlin, got through customs okay. Checked at the place to buy bus tickets, and the bus was coming in like 4 minutes. So I went out to the stand to catch my bus. I got on the bus and I sat down. Have you ever had that feeling when you sit down and you know that something's amiss, like something's not right, but you can't quite put your finger on it? So it takes me, 3 or 4 minutes to realize that I don't have my bag, which has all these priceless fragments in it. So I'm freaking out, and the bus is, driving away from the airport. And I run to the front of the bus, and I say to the bus driver, and I don't speak German. My German's really, really bad. So I say to the bus driver in English, I said, "Please stop." I says, "I have to get off the bus." And the guy just ignored me. He just wouldn't even look at me. So I yell at him. I'm like, you stop the bus. I have to get off the bus. And he still wouldn't. And people, other people on the bus could see I was getting agitated. So someone actually came up and started yelling at him in German for me. And he stops the bus, and I had to hoof it back to the airport. It's like a mile, So I'm running back to the airport, thinking about ways of, concealing my identity and maybe having to go into hiding just in case I lost Mr. Scoyne's priceless manuscripts.
Oh,
but
you have a hit out on
I
him for
was
that, huh?
You're right. I was freaking out about this. So, but and I walked into the airport and I saw my suitcase was literally, it was just sitting right there in the, right at the place where you buy bus tickets. There's people wandering around. And I was
Unreal.
just, it was nuts. So
you eventually got him there.
I got him there, thank God, or whoever.
And what percentage of them were fake?
So of the 9 that were tested, we had a high confidence that all of them were.
All of them were fake.
All of them were. And some of the features of them that tipped us off on this, I'll give you some examples. This was a major one. So most of them are animal skin, which is vellum. It's like a really, really thin, finely prepared leather.
Cowhide? Is it cow skin? Or?
The Dead Sea Scrolls are cow and goat hide.
Okay.
There's a handful that are actually papyrus, which is papyrus is made from drying and sticking together these special papyrus leaves, and they'll put them together, one on top of the other, and use a special resin to keep them stuck together. Over time, these materials start to delaminate, so the top layers start to peel away a little bit.
The papyrus.
Yes.
Okay.
Also on vellum.
Oh, okay.
You will get places where the top layers of the vellum will peel away or flake off.
Vellum is the animal hide?
That's the animal skin, yes. I actually think vellum is technically deer, but I don't know.
Okay.
I call it vellum. It's
Tomato.
That's right. So one of the things that we did notice that we had confirmed by the physicist was that on some of Scoyne's fragments where there's writing, the writing would slip into places where the top layer has already flaked away. Right? So
it was that meaning
already
it was written
damaged.
on old shit.
Yeah.
Written on damaged material.
By the time that the writing is added to it. So, but it did, we're looking at photographs and then we're looking under a microscope. But it's still, it's still not perfectly clear. So the physicist that we worked with had this incredibly high-powered special microscope that basically makes a 3D topography of the fragment and you're able to see then all the layers, and you can see very clearly, there's ink that literally falls off this layer and drops into this giant valley here, right? So that's one of the things that we were able to see. But maybe one of the craziest clues about the forgeries was on this one manuscript. There were salt particles
What kind of particles?
Salt.
Salt.
So, and I think, which wouldn't be unusual because the Dead Sea Scrolls come from the Dead Sea region, which has, lots of them will have, salt deposits on them.
The Dead Sea is like a super salty sea.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very salty region.
Yeah.
On the fragments that I've looked at that are authentic, where you can see some of these salt crystals, they look different, right? Like they have sort of it's not a uniform composition to them. They look kind of like these weird crystals, right, under the microscope. The salt granules that were on this particular fragment were cubical, like little salt crystals. And in the testing, it was discovered that these were actually table salt. Table salt wasn't invented until the I think the 15th or 16th century. So
that's
I'm
amazing
not sure,
that they can discern the. I mean, I guess it's not amazing. Just to like a layman like me, the fact that they can figure out the difference between table salt and sea salt.
I know, right?
Natural sea salt.
You do, yeah. You do. It's table salt has it's got a particular chemical composition. It's processed, right? So you know the things that go into processing table salt, and that's one of the ways in which you can identify it and distinguish it from like a natural salt. And I don't know whether, I mean, it's still a mystery. It looks like somebody literally took a salt shaker and just sprinkled salt on it. Was that an attempt to try and convince someone that, oh, look, there's salt on it, it came from the Dead Sea? Or was it just an accident even? Somebody was having lunch and...
Have you ever heard of any other ancient scrolls on antiquity markets that have been forged?
Oh, sure.
Really?
Yeah. So like, there's a famous one that's fairly recent, actually. There was big news that was made, I think around 2000, it was probably sometime between 2010 2013, of a fragment written in Coptic. Coptic is like I don't know the best way to describe it. It's like it's in a language that was used in Egypt, but the letters are Greek. But there's a Coptic church, an ancient Coptic church. So there's a lot of ancient Coptic Christian literature. So there was a fragment that was discovered and published by a very prominent New Testament scholar at Harvard. And she called it the Gospel of Jesus' Wife because in it seems to tell this story about how Jesus was potentially married and had a woman that there it is.
Wow, that's it, huh?
And it's about the size of a credit card.
Can you punch in on that? Oh, there. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
What is this? Is Coptic?
That's Coptic. I don't read Coptic, by the way.
That looks like English.
But
I see an N. I see an N, a T, an M.
Well, you probably actually see an I and
well, not English, but like English letters.
Yeah. So
our alphabet.
But that's actually an Ada and a Tav and an N, a T, and a yeah.
Okay, so this was Jesus's evidence that Jesus had a wife.
Yeah.
So
well, it talks about I don't remember what exactly the text says, and like I said, I don't read Coptic. So, but it makes reference to a woman that Jesus seems to be married to. It was very exciting when this was published. Now, over the course of a few years of investigation, this is a fragment that was I believe carbon dated, and it came up really late. So like
how late?
I think it was maybe 9th, 10th century AD, and paleographers, the people who analyze the script, were suggesting that it was much older than that, like 3rd, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. So, but this one made big headlines, and the scholar who published it at Harvard ended up kind of having her these are the sorts of career-ending things that happen. But
This was a scholar at Harvard.
Yeah.
What kind of scholar, do you know?
She's a New Testament scholar.
A New Testament scholar.
So
That's so funny to me. I talked about this on so many podcasts,
Yeah, right.
but like to be a New Testament scholar seems so
weird, odd. Yeah.
odd that you just want to study this one thing. Like
Yeah.
to have this narrow focus. I mean, I guess it's not that weird if you think about it. I mean, just like the nature of the topic, it's weird.
Yeah, and
like it's understandable to have a narrow field of research.
specializations are getting narrower and narrower too, right? Just as knowledge expands. And maybe to give a sense of how this works, I know one of my professors in grad school, talked about when he was a student, the entire bibliography of everything that had been published in every language, like in terms of scholarship, on a topic like the Gospel of John, which is one of the Gospels in the New Testament. He said that is something that somebody could actually read in their lifetime. Like it was only 40, 50, 60 pages of sources. By the time I was a student, you're talking about the bibliography exploding to thousands and thousands of pages. Like there's so much.
Yeah.
And because the knowledge base grows, it becomes more difficult to do things very broadly, which is why people start to specializations become much more narrow as a result of that, right? Which isn't great, but it's kind of that's the situation we're in now.
Well, how many of these New Testament scholars are actually Christians?
Sure, like this is an important question, or even biblical scholars generally, because not all biblical scholars are New Testament.
No, I've had a few on
right?
here that I've had actually one biblical scholar on here, I think, that is not a Christian or a practicing Christian. I think
two
he
now.
was. Oh, two. Wow. Awesome. You're number two.
So I'm number two. So the majority, I would say, are Christians or Jewish. And I mean, this stands to reason, because the people who would have the most interest in these texts, in this literature,
would subscribe to the belief.
And that's where I started too.
Really?
Right. Yeah, I was originally planning to be a pastor at a church. Didn't particularly like it very much, had an affinity for the languages and the history. And over time, just kind of switched tracks. And then over more time, I just stopped believing the things that I believed when I was younger.
What do you think made you stop believing in it?
That's a complicated question. And it's a variety of things. One of the things certainly is the fact, like when you go into the scholarship of the Bible, you quickly discover that it's a very different type of book than you thought it was. And that all the literature in there is quite different than you thought it was.
How so?
Well, you grow up thinking, or at least I grew up thinking, that Moses was a guy who actually led a group of people out of Egypt into Israel, and then he crossed the Red Sea, and all this stuff actually happened. You learn things like this, right? Or that Daniel was actually a guy who was living in Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar actually put him in, a den full of lions. These are the sorts of things that you can, lots of people are taught as having actually happened. You discover that's all, not what happened. So there probably was no Moses. The Israelites probably did not come out of Egypt. In fact, what we know now is that the Israelites, the people from whom the Old Testament, the text of the Hebrew Bible came, were Canaanites. There were people who were always there. And it's, the religions as it's presented in the Bible is you get this impression that this was the way people worshiped God all the time. But then when you encounter the archaeological record and when you compare these texts to other ancient Near Eastern texts, you say, well, no. The people who wrote these biblical texts probably came out of a world that looked very much like all of their neighbors. So one of the things you think, lots of people think when they encounter the Old Testament, is that everyone was a monotheist. They all believe there's just one God, and all the other gods are fake.
Monists.
So yeah, it's and that's just not true.
Y'all know I've been talking about Verso on this podcast for years now, ever since my favorite neuroscientist, nutritional scientist, and hunk, Dom D'Agostino, introduced me to this stuff. And I've been using it every morning ever since. Verso helps me feel more youthful, gives me more energy, better cognition, and better sleep. But there's a totally unexpected benefit that folks can get from Verso, which I wasn't even aware of until recently, and that is weight loss. Cell Being by Verso isn't just about slowing down the aging process. It's packed with research-backed ingredients that also promote fat loss. These ingredients have been proven in both animal and human studies to boost metabolism and improve body composition through a variety of body mechanisms. One aspect is how these ingredients increase the body's process to break down fat and act as a calorie restriction mimetic, essentially fooling your body into thinking it's consuming fewer calories. They also help regulate glucose and leptin levels, which suppress hunger, increase feelings of fullness, and effectively curb your cravings. I take Cell Being every day to feel like a younger version of myself, combating the signs of aging, which is amazing on its own. Experiencing fat loss is just an added benefit that I wasn't aware of, but I'm super happy about. Plus, Verso ensures transparency and quality by publishing third-party testing results for each batch they produce, so you know you're getting exactly what you're paying for. So if you've stuck around this far, you want to check out Verso and support the show at the same time, head on over to ver.so/Danny and use the coupon code Danny at checkout to save 15% on your first order. Again, that's ver.so/Danny and use the coupon code Danny for 15% off your first order. It's linked below. Now back to the show.
The original writers of the Bible were polytheists. They believed in many gods. But the way the texts have been written, the way they present the situation, they're deeply they're deeply biased. They propagandize a lot of this material. A lot of the texts were written, by people who were had their own political, religious agendas that they're trying to forward, and you start to see all this sort of stuff, and it starts to I guess raise questions. It started to raise questions for me about how much can I trust these texts, this Bible? What do I, in terms of it being something divine? No, it's not that. It's a very human book. So I think that's kind of where it started for me. It also makes, in my mind now, it makes the text actually quite a bit more interesting and exciting because you're dealing with real people, right, in real situations. But I don't know. It was that was a contributing factor, but there were, there's other things too.
Yeah, one of the things that seems so crazy to me, what our buddy Neil over there explained to me, was that I think it's like 900 or 1,000 years after Moses' death until we get actual writing about him. Yeah. Which was what, the Septuagint?
Well, there's Greek writings that mention his name. And we were actually just talking about this yesterday. I personally think that you can see some reflections of this Moses figure a little earlier than that, not 1,000 years before that, but I think you can see some mention of him as early as maybe the 8th or the 7th century BC, which is still 500 years after he supposedly
What is
lived.
that? What are you referring to?
So there's a text. It's in the Bible. There's a text in the book of Hosea. This is a prophet who wrote probably in the 8th century BCE, and I can probably actually just bring it up here.
Yeah,
and
give Kipp the wheel. There you go.
Okay, so we'll go to Amos 12. So this is a prophecy that scholars tend to date to the 8th century. And here he's I'll just get to
And this is
stuff where
this is from what text specifically?
so this is the book of Amos, which is in the Bible.
Which was written when?
Sorry, not Amos, Hosea. I got that right.
Hosea. and when was this text written?
Most scholars think 8th century, and the reason we think that is because all of what Hosea is talking about is the end of the kingdom of Israel in the north in 722 BCE. But he's writing before that has happened. Like he's writing to the people who are there and telling them, you're in great danger because the Assyrians are coming to kill you. You need to make all these dramatic changes because God is angry at you.
Right.
And if you don't, then the Assyrians are going to come and destroy you. And that's something that eventually happened, right? But this is all written prior, beforehand. So in this text, though, he does talk a little bit about...
Can you zoom in a little bit?
I probably can. Let me get to the right... Oh, no, that's why I'm in Amos, dude. This is my own translation.
Okay.
Of the text. Let's go there. Nice and big. All right. So here.
That's gorgeous.
Yeah. So now where it says Ephraim here. So Ephraim has said, this is speaking to the people who live in the city of Samaria.
Okay.
Sometime before 722 BCE. So this is before the Assyrians are coming to kill them all, right? So, and Hosea, the prophet, is speaking to them and telling them, you have fucked up. And because of that, the Assyrians are coming to kill you. You need to fix this. You need to change your ways. Otherwise, you're all going to be dead. And here, this is what he says. He says, so Ephraim has said, yes, I am rich. I have sought power for myself. All of my property they cannot hold against me for wrongdoing, which is sin. Now, Hosea is speaking as if he's God. I, Yahweh, am your God. Ever since the land of Egypt, I will settle you once again in tents, as in the days of old, when I spoke to prophets, when I increased visions, parables by the hands of prophets. But in Gilead is iniquity, and they are utterly worthless. So you have here, you have mention of this exit from Egypt. These people came out of Egypt ever since the land of Egypt. They were settling, they were living in tents ever since the days of old when I spoke to prophets, when I increased visions. Let me just look here at, I have another, there's another part of this.
So
here we go.
So this is basically what academia or the consensus is, that he's talking about something that's happening in like 3000 BC.
No, 8th century BCE.
8th century. Okay.
So
800. Got it.
So yeah, like sometime before 722 BC.
So much closer to the death of Moses.
Closer. But, and again, importantly, scholars by and large don't think that there was a Moses. They think that this guy was certainly...
Really?
Yeah. I
Even
would say,
religious scholars?
Well, a number of religious scholars, yes.
People who subscribe to it.
Not all of them.
Okay.
But, and, religious people will have complicated ways of I guess, compartmentalizing and even aligning various things that they believe.
Right.
One of the really interesting things, here, this, I can, just scrolling down towards the end, he goes on to say, I think this part is quite interesting. By a prophet, Yahweh brought Israel up from Egypt. By a prophet, he was kept. So scholars look at that and think, well, that's probably an early reference to this Moses figure. But I think it's really interesting because he's not named. It doesn't call him Moses.
Right.
So when I look at this, I think, this Moses tradition, wherever it came from, he probably didn't have the name Moses to start. And it probably looked quite a bit different than the story that ended up surviving and being told in, the book of Exodus. So it's I would say that it's something that you can trace maybe as far, I would say the earliest you can trace it as far back is probably like the 8th century.
Okay, but biologically, how early can we trace it?
Biologically,
the actual text,
the actual manuscripts, the actual artifacts themselves.
Yeah.
No, not until the 3rd century BCE. So, and
it's in what language?
That would be in Greek, I believe,
Greek.
and we have Hebrew manuscripts from the same period of time as well, where you will find the name Moses. Yeah,
Hebrew manuscripts, and that's Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yep.
Okay.
Within the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Wow.
So, it's frustrating on the one hand because you can't get the actual artifacts themselves, right? Like you can't get the physical evidence for the stuff that's being reported. But by the same token, a lot of this stuff didn't just appear out of thin air. These were traditions that people kept and transmitted over longer periods of time, and I think changed and were reshaped.
So the idea is this was probably, you believe, found whenever it was found, it was dated back to 300 BC probably.
Yeah.
And it was a rewriting or a retelling of a story that happened around 800.
Yeah, probably. Oh. So, and some of this too, like the way scholars, we do have, now I'll mention a couple of other things. The very oldest biblical texts that we have are these tiny little silver amulets called the Kitif Hinnom amulets. They contain text on them written in Hebrew of a priestly blessing that appears in the biblical book of Numbers, chapter 23. And these date to the 6th century BCE. So now,
what are they made of?
Silver. So somebody had written out this little blessing on these little amulets, probably rolled them up, carried them, maybe on a necklace or put them in a pocket as like a charm to protect protect someone from evil.
What language?
Hebrew.
Wow. So,
and the old Hebrew, like the actual Hebrew. When you see stuff like this, right? Like this is Hebrew that we're most familiar with. Mm-hmm. This particular script here is actually Aramaic. Hebrew script looks quite different from this. And what happened was the Jews or the people who came out of Israel. So sorry, I have to go back here. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II in 586 or 587 BC. Mm-hmm. And he took people who lived in Jerusalem and shipped them all back to Babylon.
Right.
Aramaic was the lingua franca of Babylon at the time this happened. Franca? That's the language that they spoke in and that they wrote. It's very closely related to Hebrew. They have the same letters, they just look different. So what happened was the people who left Jerusalem and went to Babylon started collecting their Hebrew texts in this new script, which is why it looks like this. Mm. But the Kitif Hinnom amulets are written on this old form of what we know as actual Hebrew. And Hebrew's an interesting language, like the original language, because it survives in what looks like a couple of different dialects. You have things like the Moabite inscription, which dates to the 9th century BCE, which was written by a Moabite king named Mesha. He was not an Israelite, but he was using the same language or something very close to the same language as Hebrew. But, scholars identify it as Moabite. We also have a couple of texts written in these other another language like Ammonite. And the
And
reason
these are all coming from where?
all from this tiny little area.
This is all the same as the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, it's the same area.
Same area.
So, but this is way earlier, right?
Okay.
So these languages are all very closely related.
Yeah.
To the point where it's difficult even to tell the differences between them.
Okay.
But it looks like there's these languages are starting to develop in this region of Israel, Palestine, modern day Israel, Palestine, but as far back as the 9th century BC. And then the only surviving language out of that group is Hebrew, which, you know, the Jews were using to write their literature at the time that they were writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they wrote all sorts of stuff in Hebrew, because I mentioned we found anywhere from 200 to 300 copies of texts that we know from, you know, the Bible. They had all sorts of other stuff too.
Like what other kind of stuff were they writing
so
about?
they had you know, they had texts that contained stories in them. Lots of these are really fragmentary, unfortunately, but they were telling stories of famous people from the Bible. Like I did
so it's biblical still.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but they're really different, right?
Was there any like political stuff or
think
medical stuff?
No medical stuff.
Or
so
legal stuff?
Lots of legal stuff.
Really?
Yes. So one of the most interesting manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls is something called the Temple Scroll. And this manuscript was discovered in Cave 11. So it was the last cave. Mm-hmm. It was discovered in 1953. It is the largest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, measuring I think it's well over 30 feet. I'm not sure. There it is. Now, if you click on that image there, it should pull the whole thing up, or does it? No.
This thing's 30 feet.
Yeah, actually, you can see he can go back to the other page for a second. You can get
hit the X.
Hit the X. Yeah, you can get no, not there. Let me. Actually, can I pull it up?
Sure.
I'll pull it up. It's probably easier if I do this. Okay, let me pull this up and I'll show you. So the temple, as I'm bringing this up, I'll talk a little bit about this.
Right.
It's not that one. It's it's this very, very long manuscript. Mm-hmm. Let's see, Dead Sea Scrolls. Is it? I have galleries map. Actually, it's better if I have to. I hate using Safari, but I have like my bookmarks.
So
on Safari.
All of these Hebrew texts date to about the same time, about between 1 to 200 BC.
Yeah. So here I can show you the Temple Scroll.
Oh, wow.
So actually, let's just go down here and do this. There you go.
Wow.
It's gigantic.
So let me ask you this. Out of all of, we talked earlier about a lot of fakes.
Yeah.
Out of all of the texts that we know came from those caves, are all of those real?
We're really confident that they are. And there's a variety of reasons for this. First of all, it's the carbon dating. Secondly, there have been DNA testing done on a number of the manuscripts as well, which has helped. So I had mentioned that Bedouin sheep herders from the Ta'amida tribe had discovered a lot of the material from the caves in the desert. Scholars have actually gone and excavated the caves themselves and also found fragments that they've been able to like physically match with stuff that the Bedouin was bringing in as well. So this is an example of where, with a high degree of confidence, we know this stuff came from where, you know, it's supposed to have come from. It was found in, you know, the dirt at the site. So, but the Temple Scroll itself is a legal text. It is a collection of rules and instructions for the readers in terms of how they're supposed to worship God in the last days when God comes back. And
Was everything based on God?
pretty much, these people were deeply,
And this, we're talking like
deeply
monotheistic?
religious. At this point, yeah. But in they still believed in other like spiritual beings, lesser beings. They believed in angels and demons and
So
things like that.
although there's a variety of different stuff, stories, legal stuff, it's all based on
focused
Bible.
It's all centered on that.
Okay.
So, and that's
Is there any-
just what
is there-
people wrote about.
Is there anything that's not about the Bible?
In various other caves, yeah. So scholars have found like stuff that most people would consider pretty boring, but are really interesting to historians and anthropologists. We find lots of documentary texts. So these are letters, these are bills of sale, these are lists,
Interesting.
these are contracts. And they would be written on, a lot of them appear on papyrus, but most of them appear on what are called ostraca, which are fragments of pottery, right? Because these writing materials, animal skins, papyrus, it's really expensive. It's really hard to make. So what was absolutely plentiful to people in the area were fragments of pottery. So they would write on those.
Okay.
Contracts, letters, that's what they would use. And we literally have thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. And it's using these that scholars tend to get a strong sense of who these people were, how they interacted with one another, their culture, their ideas, their familiarity with language and with reading and writing even. And most of these are written in Aramaic, which is the language that people were speaking in the area, but lots were also written in Hebrew and a handful were written in Greek. So yeah, but it was this particular part of the world though was a religiously saturated world where as near as we can tell based on the stuff that we have at our disposal, people believed that the gods or their god affected every part of their lives. The people who wrote and collected the Dead Sea Scrolls have texts where they seem to have believed that they would commune. They believed that the temple in Jerusalem was totally corrupt, and was just no longer functional. It was just it was terrible. Couldn't use the temple anymore, so they can't go and do the rituals that they used to do or participate in the ceremonies that they used to at the temple. So they believed that they could actually access the celestial temple, the temple of God himself, and that they would commune with the angels on a regular basis. In the War Scroll that I mentioned, where they talked about this battle that they were going to fight with the forces of evil and in the last days, the beginning part of this text talks about how you're supposed to organize yourself as an army, things that you're supposed to do in order to prepare yourself for this final battle. And in this text, they were very, very concerned. Well, generally, they were very, very concerned about being ritually pure, making sure that you were clean, basically, because you were constantly in the presence of divine beings. They believed that they would be in these military camps, camped alongside of angels, getting ready for the final battle. So, and that's the kind of stuff that we read about in the Temple Scroll.
Do people like you take John Marco Allegro seriously?
Oh, so on some things, yes. not all things though. So
he dedicated like 30 years of his life, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
A large portion of his life to deciphering and translating these Dead Sea Scrolls. And his idea is that it was based on ancient fertility rituals.
Right.
And the mushrooms, his idea of the mushroom was like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm sure you're way more familiar with him than I am, but the way mushrooms grow are very different from plants.
Right.
So things aren't fertilized. There's no seed, right? There's some mycelium comes out of the ground. Rain comes from the sky, and these mushrooms appear. So they're kind of like he equates that to the Virgin Mary and Jesus being born.
Yeah.
So his idea is Jesus was a psychedelic mushroom, right?
Yeah. That's
You like that, Steve?
that's a good summary. But that's basically his idea. But that's a particular idea that all scholars have basically suggested.
Which is not surprising. They don't agree with that.
No, that's true. However, the reasons many of them dismissed Allegro because it conflicted with religious institutions. But that's not the only problems. Like from an academic perspective, his work is sloppy. So,
really?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, one of the things that Allegro's theory is based on is his reading of ancient Sumerian.
Yes.
And
this was actually in like the first chapter of his book. I was even getting like red flags were popping up to me because I didn't know. I mean, I had no idea that you could actually take roots from Hebrew and link them to Sumerian.
You can't.
You can't. Okay. That's the foundation
problem, right?
of everything.
It is.
That's the foundation of his entire book.
Yes. And that's the major problem with it. As far as I can tell, I'm not sure he knew Sumerian.
Carl Ruck endorsed his book, though. And Carl Ruck's like one of the most legendary classicists out there.
He doesn't know Sumerian either. I don't.
Right. But don't classicists know about this stuff, like the links between languages and the roots?
It depends on the scholar, and not every scholar is able to recognize. Like one of the things, Allegro makes some interesting connections, but when you actually sit down and talk to a Sumerian specialist,
right?
And I know a few.
Oh, are you really?
Yeah. Yeah, I should actually put you in touch with one or two.
I'd love to.
Yeah, but they'll tell you it's nonsense. Basically, what Allegro was doing was he looked at the way some Sumerian words seem to sound when you put them together in a compound. Like if you use this particular verb and this noun, it makes this particular sound. That sounds a little bit like this Hebrew word, so it must mean that. When in actual fact it doesn't, and it's complicated further by the fact that in Sumerian, the cuneiform script. This is what the script of that the Sumerian language is written in. The cuneiform script that's used for Sumerian is composed of these signs that are made with a triangular wedge by pressing it into soft clay. So you use this wedge to make these in different combinations to make these signs.
Talking about like a tool, like a little tool.
It's like a little chopstick, but in a triangular wedge shape, and you press it down.
Right.
That's how you make the cuneiform signs. In Sumerian, one sign can have like 7, 8, 9 different meanings based on how it's used in context.
Wow.
Right? So I mean it's not all that out there. If you think about in English, you have words like there, which could mean that place over there, or their house, referring to Neil's family and where they live. So, it's not all that out there. it is a little bit more complicated. But I think what Allegro was doing was looking at these signs out of context and, mixing up meanings that they might have with meanings he thought they could have. And then the other problem, and this is something actually that his daughter, Judith Brown, wrote a nice biography about John Allegro, and she pointed this out actually as well, that when Allegro, he had like hundreds of footnotes in his book, documenting, the usage of these Sumerian words and what they mean. He would put an asterisk beside a lot of these Sumerian words where he had this inkling, like it sounds like it could mean this, but there's no examples in actual Sumerian of this particular word being used. So he's basically hypothesizing. He's thinking maybe there could be a word in Sumerian, even though we don't have any evidence for it. So he was basically making up these roots as a way to forward his ideas. So this was the scholarly critique of his work. People who know the language pick it up and look at it, and they'll tell you, yeah, this just does not work. And it's problematic as well, I think, from an historical perspective, because by the time of the 1st century, when the New Testament document, by the time when the Christians first emerge, none of them are reading Sumerian. Sumerian is basically a dead language by this point. Nobody speaks it or reads it. And then another final problem with Allegro's work is he wrote this book back in the 1970s, right. And there's a pile more published Sumerian literature since then, which has dramatically expanded what scholars actually know about the language. So
more was found?
Yeah, there are literally thousands and thousands of Sumerian texts that nobody has even translated.
Really?
So yeah, there's piles and piles.
Where did they find those? They're tablets. They're all tablets?
Yeah, these are mostly out in modern day Iraq is where a lot of this stuff comes from.
Are these also found in caves?
I think maybe. Most of them, though, are just excavated out of buildings that have been
and there's
buried
like
in the dirt over
emerald
time.
Tablets and shit like that.
I don't know about any of that. But
you ever heard of Billy Carson?
Yeah,
he's been on here. He talks about all the tablets that he's read.
How's Billy Carson's Sumerian?
According to him, it's pretty good.
Really?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't believe him. Honestly,
really?
No. Having watched him,
I love all the ancient alien
I know
idea.
You do. Yeah.
Aliens and
it's
pyramids,
fun.
and it's super fun.
But you should honestly take it from people who actually know this stuff, because I don't think in the stuff that I've listened to from Billy Carson, he doesn't. I don't think he actually knows.
Well, that stuff originally came from Zecharia Sitchin.
That's right. Yeah.
I think they're pulling a lot of the ideas from Zecharia Sitchin. The Anunnaki came from Nibiru and came here to create humans, which were the.
I should put you in touch with my friend, because
I would love to.
Yeah, I will. So
if it would be a bittersweet moment, but
we like to. You like to play in the sandbox, but in the end, you wanna. Yeah, you want to believe things that are true, right?
What is true nowadays?
Right.
Truth is a very slippery thing.
That's true,
especially in the age of the internet.
Indeed, it's a wonderful tool, but it's the bane of my existence.
Have you ever heard of these? These are granite. This is a 3D print of a granite,
very cool,
of a dynastic Egyptian vase. And they were found in most of them are found in the Bent Pyramid in Egypt. And they had them scanned and measured with light scanning machines.
Yeah, right.
And they found out they were perfectly symmetrical within...
Oh, that's fun.
Within the variation. Like the most unsymmetrical they are is like less than the width of a human hair.
That's wild.
And it's made out of, most of them are made out of like red granite, which is one of the hardest stones on earth.
Yeah.
So it goes against like the copper chisel pounding stones that the consensus is the Egyptians were using in the dynastic period, which is like wild, which really props up our alien idea.
Or, I don't know, maybe just human beings are pretty clever. And I don't know.
But how crazy is it that we can't figure out how they did it back then? Like 1 + 2 doesn't equal 3
Yeah,
here.
I know. Yeah. So as someone who studies the ancient world, one element of the ancient world, you know, I have come to realize that every time I have posited, well, there's no way an ancient person could have done this or known this, oftentimes, you know, it's they were much more on top of things than we give them credit for. So, and I don't know.
I know, like that. I like the idea that, I mean, I don't know if I like the idea, but there's a lot of people who have the idea that way back in history, human beings were more advanced than we are today.
Yeah.
And that maybe like a cataclysm reset us back to the Stone Age.
Yeah. I don't, yeah.
Or maybe, or maybe humanity, maybe human beings, we atrophy like cells do. We get less and less intelligent.
Well, I think that that's certainly a theory that on the basis of the way things seem to be going over the last, 20, 30, 40 years.
With society,
that's
for sure.
something that you could forward. But yeah, I don't know. I just like to see more evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too, man.
So
it's definitely a mystery.
Yeah, it is definitely a mystery. But I don't know anything about aliens.
Yeah. The Allegro, I think Allegro was onto something with the mushrooms too, because there's a lot of I read recently, actually, again, was Road to Eleusis by Carl Ruck, where he talks about the mystery cults.
Yeah.
And all of the drug rituals they were doing with the psychedelic ergot and stuff like that. And I think my very terribly formed idea of what God is, I think it makes the most sense that these people were finding God through psychedelics and they were seeing God through
I
these
absolutely
experiences.
think that happened, but I don't think that's all that happened. So, and even in terms of, developing altered states of consciousness as a way of accessing the divine, you don't always need psychedelics even to do that, right?
That's true.
And this is something that, and you can go to, the Pentecostal church down the street and see people engage in this same kind of stuff today without the usage of drugs, where just the usage of, highly emotional music,
breathing,
the repetition of words and songs, breathing, all these things can produce these ecstatic states by which we think we have these psychedelic experiences.
Sure.
So, and oftentimes I think our brains are, they will produce images and thoughts and ideas in our heads that can seem so real, just on their own without the usage of drugs, right? Yeah. From an economic standpoint, it makes sense to me that this is a significant. I'm not denying that psychedelics were used in antiquity. I think they absolutely were, and that they were connected to religious experiences. But in terms of religious experience generally, it was way cheaper to just produce altered states of consciousness through ways in which we affect our own bodies through some of these, And it's difficult to, this is really the big challenge, right? Is reading texts and trying to gauge the usage of chemicals through the literature that we have. It's probably easier in some contexts, but not all contexts. Like in the text that I read, there is not much of any discussion at all about substances. And I know,
Hebrew texts.
Yeah, in the Hebrew texts. And I would say that the Greek texts, the Greek religious texts of the Christians, the New Testament, the early Christians, even there, I don't see it. So, sorry.
Have you read a lot of it?
The New Testament?
A lot of the Greek texts?
Not a ton. That's not really my thing. So, but yeah.
What is the, when it comes to the period of time we're looking at when the Dead Sea Scrolls came from?
Yeah.
What is the percentage of text, like out of all of the texts that we have, how many of them are in this ancient Hebrew language compared to other languages that we have?
I wouldn't even know. Just because depending on the time period, and I mean, we have a lot of ancient literature in a variety of other languages, but you're right in thinking that it's a small number compared to texts that you have in a variety of other languages. And one of the reasons why the Dead Sea Scrolls have received the amount of attention they have is because of the religious.
Because it props up religion.
It does, and this has been a problem.
Is this why this consensus among scholars is that the Septuagint was a translation from Hebrew into Greek? This is getting back to the thing that you and Ammon had the debate on Neil's channel about.
So the reason, no, I don't think it has anything to do with that.
Okay.
So the reasons why scholars think that the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew texts is because when you investigate the two texts side by side, the Hebrew next to the Greek, you see things taking place within the Greek text that indicate there is a Hebrew syntactical feature that they are grappling with, that they're dealing with. Like they're not, so Greek and Hebrew are not related, like they're distantly related languages, right? Greek is Indo-European, Hebrew is Northwest Semitic. Okay. The languages function differently. So, there are clues within the Greek text, and it's like any translation, right? You encounter colloquialisms or idioms or turns of phrase in one language that don't translate well into another language.
Yes.
And when someone encounters a feature like that of the text, not quite knowing what to do with it, they'll develop various strategies. And there are things that we can actually point to in the Greek text where we see that happening. I know you talked to Dan McClellan about a few of these, right? He mentioned the.
I just don't understand how we have this Septuagint, which is in Greek, and why they came up with, it's in Greek, but we're gonna just hypothesize that this was originally Hebrew.
Well,
but there's no evidence that it was originally
Hebrew. There is lots of evidence. Well, first of all, let's talk about the manuscripts.
Okay.
How many Septuagint manuscripts are there?
I have no idea.
There are. So we have Septuagint manuscripts.
I don't know anything about any of this stuff. I'm just coming in, like I told you, my education on this whole topic is Ammon and Neil.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of Septuagint manuscripts, we have a whole bunch from like the 3rd, 4th, 5th century AD.
Okay.
The farther back you go, first century AD,
Written in Greek.
First century BC, second century BC, there's very few.
Okay.
We have tiny, tiny little fragments, little bits and pieces.
Okay.
I think our oldest Septuagint manuscripts date to around the mid-2nd century BCE. Just in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we literally have thousands and thousands of fragments, Hebrew fragments, that are from the 2nd century, 1st century BC. Now, one of the things that we also see in the Hebrew fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, as I mentioned before, we have multiple copies of individual books of the Bible, multiple copies of the book of Isaiah, multiple copies of the book of Daniel, Genesis, Exodus, all these different books in different versions. One of the things about the Septuagint that we have, which is, I believe that the Septuagint, this Greek text of the Bible that we have, is mostly drawn from a particular manuscript called the Codex Sinaiticus, which dates to the 4th century BC, or 4th century CE, 4th century AD. Right? So, but one of the things that you see when you compare that text to the Hebrew text is, in a lot of places, it's pretty dramatically different. For example, the book of Jeremiah is the largest book by word count in Hebrew in the Old Testament. And the Septuagint version of it is shorter by, I think it's 15%. So it's a much shorter text, and it's in a dramatically different order. It's clearly way different. There's other texts from the Bible that are like this. The book of Exodus is like this. The book of First Samuel is like this.
So you're saying, and I'm just trying to make sure I understand this correctly, you're saying that the Greek is using less words and the Hebrew is using more words?
What I'm saying is that in certain places, it looks like if we think that let's for the sake of this part of the discussion, let's say that there's a Hebrew original to the Greek.
Okay.
What it looks like is that the Septuagint is using a different Hebrew text than the Hebrew text that we have preserved. So it's very different. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have discovered Hebrew copies that look like the text of the Septuagint in terms of the differences compared to the Hebrew text that we have inherited. So I know this gets complicated.
Yeah.
But within the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've got different versions of the same text. They're not all exactly the same.
So there's copies.
Yes, copies, and some of them really, really different. For example, as I was talking about the book of Jeremiah, in the Septuagint, their version, the Septuagint version, the Greek version, ends in Jeremiah chapter 44. In the Hebrew version, ends in chapter 52. So there's a whole bunch of extra material, right? And again, like I said, it's all rearranged. And yet we have a Hebrew copy from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so written in Hebrew, that also ends in chapter 44. Looks just like this Greek text. No, I'm good.
I'm using it to stay awake.
Yeah, sorry.
30 minutes of sleep last night.
It's brutal. That hurricane just knocked everything out of you.
Okay.
Out of everyone. So that's on. I'm just saying on the one side of this, we have this manuscript question. There's not a lot from the period. We have actually a lot more copies of Hebrew biblical manuscripts from an early period than we do these Greek Septuagint manuscripts. But there's also the language problems. And I mean, we could talk a little bit about that if you wanted to.
So my understanding of the language is that the Greek is a much more deep and complex language than the Hebrew.
That's true.
And the Greek has like over 1 million unique words, and Hebrew has like 6,000.
I think that the way you make those, the way that Ammon comes up with those numbers,
is that not true?
It depends on how you count them. I've never heard anyone but him say that there's 1 million. He's the only person I've heard suggest that. I think it's probably more accurate to say closer to 250,000.
Word forms versus
Neil, can you corroborate this for us?
There's 1.5 unique word forms, but that's counting all of the paradigms of verbs.
Oh, well, see, I mean, you do the same thing.
1.5 million unique word forms.
Right.
But what does that mean?
I mean,
one verb, for example, luo can be luo men, luo seen, luo thin. That could be different versions of the word to
in English. Well, I'll try and explain this in English. Okay. So we have a verb, run, right? Mm-hmm. A form of the verb using the subject and the object. If we're speaking about you personally running to the store, you could say, I ran to the store. Yeah. I ran is a verb form. You ran is another verb form. He ran is another verb form. Mm-hmm. In Greek, as well as in Hebrew, that form is represented by a word that looks a little different each time.
So different ways the same word is used. He's counting that as unique word forms. So when you say there's 8,000 unique words in Hebrew, are you doing the same thing?
No. So I think he's probably only just counting the roots there.
It's lamata. It's 250,000.
So 250,000.
What'd you say?
250,000 lamata, 1.5 unique word forms in Greek. That's the number of the up-to-date lexicons.
Now I think importantly, I'm happy to agree that Greek is definitely a more developed language in terms of some of the complexity. So and there's a lot more literature.
So to my untrained brain on linguistics and all this stuff, I don't know anything about translating. I've never translated anything in my life. Right. But the way my layman brain thinks about this is if I found a flying saucer in the desert and it came from some advanced civilization and I'm some primitive ape trying to figure out what it is and recreate it, I would create probably something closer to like a horse and buggy compared to that flying saucer.
Yep.
So if the Septuagint is this incredibly deep, sophisticated language with many more words being used, how are you coming up with something that is less advanced and less developed out of that?
How do I answer that question? Just because that's not really how translators, people working with the ancient languages, think through these things.
So sorry, I framed that backwards.
I think you did.
I'm saying, I framed it backwards. So the idea, so if it was originally Hebrew, it was the horse and buggy, and they came up with the flying saucer as the translation, right? Because it was translated into Greek, which was the much more complex language.
Yep.
That makes sense. That's how it's believed by scholars.
Yeah.
And it's
universal
to me
too.
That doesn't make sense. Like it's the way that was the way it's described to me and the way I understand it, and to me it doesn't make sense.
Well, I mean, you can translate anything into any other language though, regardless of the complexity. I mean, we still do this all the time, right? Like not all language, I think this depends on how you're measuring complexity too. Are we just counting numbers of words for different things? Complexity could mean different things, I think.
You guys showed on your talk that you did on Neil's Gnostic Informant channel, there was a word called theosebes, which was one word in Greek.
Oh, yeah, right.
And you guys translated it to Hebrew, and it was two words, Yireh Elohim.
Yireh Elohim, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to me, what I took from that is like Greek has 250,000 at its worst unique words.
Okay.
Hebrew has 6,000. Yet Greek took 2 words from Hebrew and made it into 1.
Yeah. But, that's how their language works. And it works different from Hebrew.
Right.
So
it just doesn't make sense to me how they would take 2 words in Hebrew and combine it into 1 word in Greek, right?
Well, they don't. I mean, they because I guess
because you would want to break it down to make it more simple, to make it understand.
Not always.
Okay.
It depends on how you understand what the text is trying to do. Like in Hebrew, there is no single word. Or at least there's various ways you could do it in Hebrew to say, actually, no, you couldn't. There is no single word, which means God-fearer, right? You have to do that through using a participle and a noun in Hebrew. But you have this adjective in Greek, which does the same thing. But that doesn't mean that just because this particular language is able to do this differently and do it in 1 word as opposed to 2, that it came first. Because we don't. I'm honestly, I don't know on terms of this is honestly to my way of thinking as someone who works with with ancient languages, the complexity argument is one that just doesn't make much sense to me, because we see ways in which you can measure complexity in different languages in different ways, but it doesn't necessarily indicate anything about which text was first. So, and I'm not sure, and
this can be confusing for people that are listening too. I suggest people who want to understand this better go to, and I can link it below. So watch the one on Neil's channel where you guys actually break down the words and you guys show them and all that.
One of the things that one of the ways that I push back on this as well is that Ammon doesn't tell you this, but the Hebrew text is not all Hebrew. Okay. Like within the Hebrew Bible, there's actually Hebrew text and there's Aramaic as well. So, and the way that the Aramaic works in some of the biblical texts is not straightforward. So, it's not just Hebrew literature. It's Hebrew and bits of Aramaic. Okay. So for example, in the book of Daniel, most scholars will tell you that the book of Daniel was written in 2 languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. The Aramaic stuff was written first, and then the Hebrew stuff was added on to it. And they just they combined it all together. And one of the reasons why scholars know this or think this, I'll just actually pull up the text here to give you the example. This happens in Daniel chapter 2. So in Daniel chapter 2, it tells this story about the king Nebuchadnezzar having a dream. And he gets very anxious because of this dream. And then you'll see here, in the English text, I'll just read at the number 3 here. Well, let's go back a little bit. So the king ordered his magicians, exorcists, sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to be summoned in order to tell the king what he had dreamed. They came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream and am full of anxiety to know what I have dreamed. The Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. Now, up to that point, where it says the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, that's written in Hebrew. Now, at this point, where they're actually speaking to the king, O king, live forever, the language changes.
Like it's a quote.
Yes, it's a quote. Now it's Aramaic. So they say, O king, live forever, relate the dream to your servants, and we will tell you its meaning. That's the end of the quote. So at this point, we would expect the text to return to Hebrew, but it doesn't. It just continues in Aramaic, and it continues there in Aramaic all the way to the end of this story. And then it tells another story, all in Aramaic, and then it tells another story, all in Aramaic. And it goes like this all the way to the end of chapter 7, before then switching back to Hebrew in chapter 8. So when scholars look at that, they go, well, it's obvious what's happening here. What happened here was they originally had this collection of stories that was originally written in Aramaic. And then they also had this collection of things that were written in Hebrew, and they put them together. And then they did some editing and added this Hebrew introduction onto that. So it's not just Hebrew. It's Hebrew as well as Aramaic. And there's other examples of this throughout the biblical text. But something like this is difficult to me. It's difficult to know. The explanation for this just doesn't work. If this was originally a Greek text, and now someone is translating that back into Hebrew, why would they include this one section in Aramaic and then switch to Aramaic, but then just keep writing in Aramaic and then decide, oh, I'm going to switch back to Hebrew again?
Kipp, did you ever get a chance to look at that letter from Julius Africanus to Origen?
I haven't looked at that.
Okay,
No.
never mind
What
that.
is that?
It's a letter from Africanus to Origen about the end of Daniel, and he's speaking about the apocryphal, not Bell and the Dragon, Susanna.
Oh, okay.
And he's basically pointing out that the way it flows in the Greek looks like an original text.
Right.
And he thinks that, but he also does say at the end of the letter, the rest of it's Hebrew.
Right.
I just want to know what your thoughts are.
Julius
Okay.
Africanus.
Yeah.
That's one of the. And the reason why I bring
When
that
was
up
he
is because
writing?
it was the early
Yeah.
3rd century,
See, that's pretty late.
200.
But
Yeah.
so there's there are elements within the text which look very clearly to be a Semitic text, and you can still see those in the Greek translation of that text. There are certain mechanical features of the Greek language which the Greek translator clearly doesn't know how to handle, and he messes it up, and will translate it in a way that doesn't work really well in Greek, because it's a feature that works in Hebrew. But I don't know how else to put it. But like you can see the same thing in the Gospels. Like a lot of times New Testament scholars will look at texts, pieces of bits and pieces in the Gospels and say, oh, this looks like what we call a Semiticism, which is a feature of the text that looks like it might have been translated out of Aramaic or out of Hebrew, or has been written by someone whose first language is Hebrew or Aramaic, and they don't know Greek as well. So, and I would also challenge this idea that the Septuagint is this incredibly magisterial text. It's written in Koine Greek, which was the common spoken Greek language of the people. This is not the same Greek that was used by, Plato and Aristotle and the great philosophers and those people.
Aren't there some quotes from Jesus in Greek?
Oh, probably. But I mean, and what are we talking about here? Like
no
Jesus. So the New Testament Gospels, and this is something that biblical scholars will tell you, are stories about Jesus, right? But how much of that stuff we can even trace back to the actual Jesus? Maybe it's very speculative. A lot of scholars will tell you within the Gospels you can't really even trace any of this stuff back to Jesus.
Right.
These are people who are telling stories about Jesus in Greek. So, of course they've got Jesus saying things in Greek. But they also knew that he knew Aramaic. So there are small occasions where they'll have him saying something in Aramaic. But
Right.
Susanna is not in the Jewish Tanakh.
So, and importantly,
What do you say?
The book of Susanna is at the end of Daniel.
Yeah,
It's not.
Okay.
and
Yeah, I
that's
just looked it up.
and
Okay.
that's a particular text. Like one of the things that we see in the Greek Bible as well, in the Septuagint, are added pieces of literature which don't appear to have a Hebrew counterpart. And some of these look like they might have been originally composed in Greek. I think Susanna is possibly a text that was originally composed in Greek by Jewish people who wrote in Greek, but maybe didn't have a Hebrew original to it. And importantly, was never translated into Hebrew.
How much Hebrew literature do we have from outside the Bible that dates before 300 BC?
Not a ton, but we do have a collection of inscriptions from places like Kintulat Ashrud, which is in the southern, close to the Sinai. There are a handful of inscriptions in Hebrew from there that survive on clay jars and on some plaster parts of the walls. There are inscriptions that were left by a couple of different kings in the region. I've already mentioned one. The Moabite stone was written by the king Misha in a form of the language that very, very closely resembles Hebrew. Then you've got a tunnel inscription in Jerusalem that's written in Hebrew. We have
About what is it biblical or no?
No, actually, this is a really interesting text because this is there's a story. There is a story in the Bible about the king Hezekiah in Jerusalem in the 8th century, who's preparing for, remember I mentioned the Assyrians came and destroyed the city of Samaria in 722. They then came down to the city of Jerusalem in the south and threatened Hezekiah. And as he saw them coming, he was preparing his defenses and getting things ready for this invasion by the Assyrians. And in the Bible, it says that he basically built a tunnel to get water from the pool, from the Gihon springs outside the city into the city. That's in order to get ready for a siege or something. So archaeologists have excavated this tunnel, which goes between the Gihon spring and the pool inside of Jerusalem, and there's an inscription inside the tunnel. But it's a really interesting inscription because the gist of it basically goes that it says this is about the tunnel, is how it begins, and then it says this is the account of the tunnel. The workers started on one end and dug for 300 meters or whatever it is. It doesn't say 300 meters, but it dug for a long time. And then there were workers that started on the other end and were digging in the same direction. And then at this point, one tunnel worker's pick broke through the stone, and we were able to hear the tunnel workers on the other side, and we met in the middle. And that's the whole inscription. It's just this story about building this tunnel. It doesn't mention any names, doesn't mention a king. It seems to be this tribute that was left by the workers who were building this tunnel. So, and it's written in Hebrew. But
Interesting.
yeah, it's kind of interesting. So,
What about the Library of Alexandria? What was out of all of the books that were in that library, what is the percentage of them that were Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic?
no, I don't know about percentages. I mean,
like,
what we know,
How much Hebrew came out of Alexandria?
probably wouldn't have been a lot of literature. I don't think that they had. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, at the time,
That's the thing to
right?
me that seems like so perplexing about this time, because it seems like there was so much Greek literature
Yeah.
from every aspect of life,
Yes.
from poetry
I
to
agree.
comedy to everything.
I agree.
And but then when you just like go to the Hebrew, it seems to be all biblical.
Yep, and that's true. And even the stuff that we have from things like the Dead Sea Scrolls reflect back on this biblical literature. Like there were other things, that I mentioned. The scrolls preserve other texts written in Hebrew
Right.
that weren't in the Bible, but they're all generally focused on God and religion. And we have some other. There's a text called the Book of Ben Sira, which was written in about 180 BCE by a Jewish man named Sirach, and it was originally written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek, and it opens, the preface of it is from the Sirach's grandson, who actually says, I translated this from Hebrew into Greek.
His name was Jesus, by the way.
Yeah, Jesus ben Sirach. Thank you. So he and we actually have a fragmentary copy of this text in Hebrew from one of the, not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably, like not in the Qumran caves, but in one of the caves from the Judean desert. So yeah, and it's basically a text of like philosophy, but very religious. Reflecting back on how to conduct yourself and how to be a good God-fearer. So there is Hebrew literature, and there's probably a lot of stuff that we've just lost. However, I think it's also true that the people who were writing in Hebrew at this particular time did not have nearly as much literature as the Greeks. They just didn't. And one of the reasons for this has to do with the way their culture developed after the end of the exile. I mean, just to kind of give you a sense of, hold on, my phone's ringing here. That's weird. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Hello. Hanging up.
Rock and roll, brother.
There we go. Okay. I should actually turn my ringer off if I can. So the I mentioned the people who wrote these Hebrew traditions, these Hebrew texts, lived in Israel up to the invasion by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, and he took a whole bunch of them with him back to Babylon, and then a number of these people returned 50, 60, 70 years later to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple, and at some point, and our knowledge of this period is really fuzzy at this point. This is like the 5th century, 5th, 4th century BC. There's a lot we don't know about this time period. So at this point, they seem to have rebuilt the temple, and they seem to have started practicing their religion again. They probably had just a smattering, a handful, the little bits of literature that they were able to take with them from Jerusalem out to Babylon and then back to Jerusalem. Probably wasn't a lot. And I would say too, I mean, it doesn't look like the kingdoms that were in this area, and this isn't just the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of Judah, but it seems to be the same for some of these other smaller kingdoms in the area, like the kingdom of Moab or the kingdom of Edom or the kingdom of Philistia.
Right.
They didn't seem to have written a lot. So they didn't have lots and lots of great epic works of literature that they were committing to writing. It was a different kind of a culture, and it was a different kind of time. So, but these are the people who came out of Jerusalem, went to Babylon, and then came back with this tiny little bit of literature that they had by the 4th, 3rd century, which by that time, the Greeks had already been, collecting piles and piles and piles of literature beyond them.
Right.
So there's no question, I don't think, that from a literary perspective, they were not in terms of volume. They just didn't have the kind of volume that was being produced in the Greek language.
At least we don't have evidence for it.
We certainly don't. Yeah, we don't have evidence for it, and we don't have.
Some people might believe that, though.
Right, that's true. Well, I mean, some people believe that Hebrew was the first language.
Right.
So,
right.
But the fact, and I tend to think too, like we don't have a lot of the epigraphic remains like stones and seals and texts from the region from this early period, largely because they weren't writing nearly as much. So, but by the same token, that's not just the only reason why we should look at something. That's not our only measure.
Yeah.
For looking at the Septuagint and comparing that to the Hebrew and going, well, there's a lot more words in Greek, therefore this must have been original, right? So it's much more complicated than that. And I would say too, as far as I know, Ammon Hillman is the only person who is forwarding this idea of Greek priority when it comes to the Bible. He doesn't know Hebrew. Certainly doesn't. If he knows it just a little bit. He doesn't know it well.
Let me ask you this. As a thought experiment.
Yeah.
Could you steel man his argument for the Greek being the original?
I think maybe. I mean, based on what I've heard, he depends quite a bit on this idea that Greek is a much more complex language, and that the text of the Septuagint, as he reads it, is much richer. But then compared to the Hebrew, he thinks it looks primitive.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's where he gets a lot of his ideas about this. And I think one of the reasons for that is because he doesn't understand the Hebrew. I mean, there's a lot of and he just doesn't understand how the language works. Because in Hebrew, you don't need nearly as many words maybe to say the same thing.
Well, you need more words in Hebrew, right?
No.
Because in
not even.
Elohim, it was
that's
Theosebes, Weire Elohim, so 1 to 2.
So that's one example.
Okay.
There's other instances where the Greek will take several words to say the same thing in Hebrew. I wonder if I can find an example just off the top of my head. Off the top of my head, I don't know, but there's certainly plenty of instances within the text where you can see.
Sorry.
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna say there are places within the text where the Greek does require more words to say the same thing in Hebrew.
What does it mean to say that the Septuagint is Hellenistic? Does that just...
Yeah, so one of the things that you do see in the text of the Septuagint, the Greek text, is that it reflects elements of Greek culture. So, and this is also maybe one of the reasons why a lot of scholars would say that it's a translation of the Hebrew original, because it's taking some aspects and turning those into, I guess, a more more Hellenistic. Hellenistic just basically means culturally Greek.
Okay.
Right? So there's a stronger Greek flavor in some places of the Septuagint compared to the Hebrew. So, and I tend to think that we probably have some, because it's still the biblical texts themselves, the literature that eventually ends up in the Bible, is still being reworked and rewritten and edited in the Hellenistic period.
Right.
And some of this is actually reflecting some Greek influence as well. So, some of the later texts.
What would this mean? let's just hypothetically say that scholars we had some sort of crazy evidence. We figured out backward time travel, and we did figure out that it was originally Greek.
Yeah.
What would be the implications on religion or the implications on any of the scholarship?
Well, I mean, the implications would be, they'd be big in terms of how we'd have to reevaluate the individual texts and how they developed. But I don't think it would make a big deal to a lot of scholars.
What about religious types?
In terms of religion?
Yeah.
You know, that's a good question, and I'm not even
like Judaism, like the origin.
Oh, that would be a challenge for Judaism, just because of how deeply tied Jewish religion is to Jewish culture, right? So, and how much that is closely connected to the language, the Hebrew language. So I think that would probably be a challenge. I'm not sure how that would affect it, but yeah, I could see that. I could see that having an effect. But it's a Hebrew text, so
right.
It's
It's interesting shit, man.
It is.
It's wild and confusing.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I probably just confused
No, you did a great job.
further.
No, it's just confusing for me, and I'm really new to this stuff, so I'm just kind of like figuring it out as I go.
Yeah, of course.
But
No, we all start somewhere, right?
yeah,
And
absolutely. Thank you.
It's a journey.
Thank you for coming down here
absolutely.
in the middle of a freaking hurricane, all the way from beautiful Canada, from cold Canada to this tropic heat.
That's right.
You risked your life to come on this podcast, man. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I certainly did. It was my first Category 4 hurricane.
We popped your cherry, man. Is it first Category 4 or first hurricane?
My first hurricane.
Your
period
first hurricane
was
period.
a Category 4.
Wow.
But my mom was like freaking out when she was like texting me all last night while it was bearing down.
This is like one of the worst hurricanes I've been through here. I've been through dozens of hurricanes in Florida growing up here, and this, like I was showing you the videos earlier, this is like the worst flooding I've ever seen.
Yeah.
All my friends' houses on the beach that are one story, the water was like 5 feet up to their neck in water. Their houses are destroyed.
Nuts,
I still don't have power. This is like the only building around here that has power right now because we got a crazy diesel generator out back powering the building.
Oh, is that how?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. See, I thought I was ready to start believing in God again. But wow, that's wild.
Yeah, I'm glad we made this happen though, man.
So here you guys were like holding on for dear life. And I was in my bedroom looking out the window going, when's it gonna start?
It was nothing in Orlando, right?
Nothing.
Yeah. No, it wasn't that bad. The winds weren't that crazy. The winds got up to like 60 miles per hour here at the worst, which is like there's tons of trees knocked over everywhere and fences if you drive up and down the streets here. But like the worst part about these hurricanes is the flooding and the storm surge that comes in, which basically just devastates people. If you're old, if you're like lots of old people in Florida, and lots of people that depend on technology to stay alive, like people that are diabetic and all this stuff, when you lose power, that can really fuck you up.
Yeah, that could be real bad.
You got to be prepared, man.
I could see that.
No joke down here. But thank you again, man. Tell people that are listening where they can find more of your work online, social media, all that stuff.
Sure. So my YouTube channel is just my name, Kipp Davis. And I do stuff about the Bible. I do stuff about the Dead Sea Scrolls, early Judaism. I'm currently working on a book, which is actually all about Israelite religion and politics and history in the period.
Oh, there goes your YouTube channel.
Look at that. There it is. Leading up
Iron
to
Maiden. Hell yeah.
Yeah, they're the best. So
man.
But that shirt, I wore that shirt out, unfortunately. But and I haven't been back to an Iron Maiden concert to get a new one. I'm a bit of a purist. I don't believe in buying the merch online.
Oh, really? You have to get it from the concert?
Got to get it from the concert, dude.
Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But
cool, man.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna do a quick 10-minute Patreon Q&A because we got some people that got some questions for you. So we're gonna end the podcast for YouTube now, and we're gonna jump over to Patreon.
I need my glasses for this.
And the Patreon link is below if you want to check that out. Goodbye, everybody.